This is the next video in my DevNet series of videos working towards a DevNet Associate certification from Cisco. Now, to get certified, we need to know Python basics. To learn the Python basics, I'm working through this text, Python Crash Course by Eric Mathis. I'm on Chapter 4, which is on lists and loops and also tuples. And so we're going to keep working with Python. So we've used the Python interpreter. We've used Nano to write Python scripts, but this time I'm going to use the Sublime text editor. So we open up the Sublime text editor. And I'm going to save a file here. So File, and I'll say Save As, and I'm going to call it chapter4.py, and I'm going to save it. We'll go to my home folder. I've got this special folder, Python_work, and I'm just going to call it chapter4.py and save it. So now the Sublime text editor knows that I'm going to be working with Python because I named it .py. So that should be pretty good. Now what I'll do is I'll start to write some Python. So we're going to start off with a list, so called authors, and we're going to make this list and we'll put some items in it. We're going to put some authors. Twain, Alcott, Dickens, whoops, I got to put it in between the single quotes here because it's a string, and Scott. So there is our list. It's of authors, and there's each author in between single quotes. We've got Twain, Alcott, Dickens, and Scott. Okay, so the next thing that's covered is in this chapter, in chapter 4, he builds on what happened in the previous chapter. So in the previous chapter, he introduced the concept of lists, but now we want to work with lists. And so we're going to loop through the lists. Now, this introduces an interesting situation because now you get to work with a block of code. And when you're doing a loop, the loop is going to look like this. For author in authors, and then the line ends with a colon. So that means that this is going to be a command block or a block of code. And to do a block of code in Python, we end here with a colon, and then on the next line we need it to be indented. And you can see that automatically Sublime Text wants to indent it for us. And it's already indented it for us, which is pretty good. It looks like it's using a tab to indent, and that's fine. We can use a tab, but we want to be consistent. If we're going to use tabs, then we want to use tabs every time. It's recommended to use spaces, 1, 2, 3, 4. So we would do maybe spaces instead. And if I go enter, you can see that Sublime Text sees that I'm using spaces. So I'm going to use spaces, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then I'll say print author. Okay, now that is my block. Now, perfect. So this is the block of code. Now this is the way it's done in Python. It's a very easy to write language because there's no curly braces and there's no parentheses. Let's just run the program to see if it works. Control B to run it, and you can see output Twain, Alcott, Dickens, and Scott. And so we looped through each author, right, in authors. Now this doesn't have to be the word author. This variable here could be, let's say, X. So for X in authors, we'll say print X. And if I do Control B, you can see it still works. So it's just a convention to have the variable here, the item in the list, kind of correspond to what it is you're looping through. So for author in authors makes the code more readable. If we look at the structure of this loop, I'm going to open up a text file here. And if we wanted to look at the loop and look at it differently, let's say from a different programming language, like let's say JavaScript, it would be written differently. There would be a for, and then there would be the condition, but the condition would be listed between parentheses, and the condition will be either true or false. And if it's true, then we do the sequence between the curly braces, and that's the block is marked off by the curly braces. And we do whatever sequence is between there. Now the sequence, which I'm going to put a pound here to signify, let's say, a comment, the sequence would have maybe multiple lines. So it would be statement 1, so we would do the line statement 1, and then we do whatever's on the next line, statement 2, and so forth until the curly brace. Then once we do all of the lines in the sequence, we check the condition again. Now the condition is either going to be true or false. Now the condition is usually not just a condition. There's usually a variable and then a condition which is either true or false, and then an iterator that will increment, or an incrementer that will increment. So in other words, when we check the condition, if it's true, we iterate or increment the variable. Then we do the sequence. Then we come back up to the condition, we check the condition. If it's true, then we increment the variable and we do the sequence again. And then we come back up here and we do it. Now let's look at that with this flow chart here. We start the loop, which in this case is a for loop. We check the condition to see whether it's true or false. If it's true, we do the sequence. After the sequence is done, we go back up, we check the condition again, if it's true or false. Also, we have to increment the variable. So if it's true, we do it again. Then we increment, test the condition, we test it again. If it's true, we do it again. If it's false, we end the loop. Now, let's compare this back to what we're doing in Python. The condition is basically that we're going to iterate through each item in this list. So for as long as there is an item in the list, then this will be true and we'll execute whatever happens in here. And if there's no item left, then it'll be false and we stop. So the first time through, we print the first author, Twain. Then we print the second author, Alcott. And so this iterates through each time. So basically, this loop, this was executed 4 times. So in other words, it looped through 4 times until there was no other items in the list. And at that point, it was false, and the loop exited. Let's add another piece here. We'll say print, and this time we'll do an F string. So we'll format an F string, and we'll say for author dot title, and we'll say, so for the author was a great writer. Okay, so now if we do Control B to run it, it loops, it says Twain, and then it says, capitalizes it by putting the title method on it. Twain was a great writer. Then on the second loop through, Alcott, and then Alcott was a great writer. And then Dickens, and then Dickens was a great writer. And then Scott was a great writer. So there we go. We're using a loop. The loop is, the colon lets us know that the next lines will need to be indented, in this case, indented 4 times. Now what happens if we don't indent this 4 times? What if we only indent this one 3 times and try it? And do Control B, and you can see we get an error. And what if we did a tab for this one? So this one is indented 1, 2, 3, 4 times, but this one has a tab, and we do Control B and run the program. Error. So, and you can see here it says inconsistent use of tabs and spaces in the indentation. So it has to be the same every time. Now we could indent 1 space. It's not considered good form, but if we indent 1 time and try to run it, you can see it worked because it was consistent. The indentation is replacing the use of curly braces, basically signifying the beginning and the end of the block, right? So usually a curly brace will signify the beginning and the end of the block, and you don't really need the indentation because in another language, in another scripting language, it would be the curly braces saying when the block starts and ends. But in Python, we don't have that. In Python, we have our loop, which has some type of condition that's iterating or repeating, and we have a colon, and then these need to be indented. 1, 2, 3, 4, let's say. That's considered good form. And then each one would need to be 4 times. And then to end the loop, all we have to do is have a line where there's not indented, and that's the end. So the indentation completely identifies the block and the colon. The next one that's covered in the book is a loop, so for value in, and then they use the range method. And this will set up a number loop, and it will loop from starting at 1, and it'll loop 1, 2, 3, 4, and then it ends at 5. And so then you can see here, so you're using the range method to create a range of numbers. So this should loop 4 times. Then we have the colon, and then indented 4 times here, print the value. So it should, this value, this variable, should identify these numbers in sequence. Let's take a look. So we do a Control B, and you can see 1, 2, 3, 4. And so it went through and did 4 times, ending at 5. So we don't get to 5. If I wanted to start at 0, I could do it this way and do a Control B, and we start at 0. Now we have 5 iterations because it goes from 0 to 4. If I go to 11 and do a Control B to run the program, you can see that it went from 0 all the way up to 10. Let's take a look at this one. In this one, we start by creating an empty list. So the list is called squares equals open and close bracket. We have an empty list, which is basically an array. And then we're going to say for value in range, and we're going to start a range to loop through some numbers, starting at 1 and then ending at 10, because that's why we have 11. And then what are we going to do with this? For this, we're going to say, okay, we'll say, I gotta make sure I indent the right number of times. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, and I don't want a tab in there, just the 4 spaces. Okay, we'll say square, which is a new variable, not squares, square, which is a variable, equals value, and then we'll say value to the power of 2. So squared values. So if we start with 1, it'll be 1 to the power of 2. So 1 times 1 equals 1. 2 times 2 equals 4. 3 times 3 equals 9. Things like that. So square should iterate through that and give us a squared exponential value. Then what we can do is we can take our list of squares, which is squared numbers. So we'll say squares. That's our array or our list. And we'll say square dot append, and we'll append the square that we're working on as we loop through. Then we end our list. We end our loop. We end our loop, and then down here we'll say print the list. Print squares. And if it worked correctly, then we looped through the numbers 10 times, starting at 1. Each time, the value is to the second power. So square to the second power. So we should have 1, and then 4, and then 9, and then 16, and so forth. And let's try it out. We'll say Control B, and you can see there it is. 1, 4, squared numbers, 16, 25, because when it loops through the 5th time and the number is 5, then square equals 5 to the second power. So 5 times 5 equals 25. And when we take our list and add that variable square, add 25 to our list. And so we're iterating through, or we're looping through and adding items programmatically into our list or our array. And that's a pretty good example. All right, let's look at another example. For the next example, I've gone back to my bash shell and I've run a Python 3 interpreter. I've got a Python, basically a Python console here. And I created an array called digits, or a list called digits. So digits equals, and then the list, and then we've got integers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So another thing that he covers in the book is how to say, all right, we can put a min value on our list. Min digits, and it should return the smallest in our list, which is 1. And we could also use it to do the max, 4 digits. And the max should be the biggest number, that's 5. And we could even do, I think, can we do a sum? I forget, yes, sum of digits. And that is all of the numbers added. So we can run a min method or min function on it, max function, or sum function on the list, and it will return the corresponding value. Another thing that's covered in the chapter is I've created a new list here called players, and in the list we have Bob, Lisa, Greg, and Jan. So 4 items, they're strings. Another thing that's covered is we know that we can say, all right, print, or we could call it print players, and then put in like item 0 here. And I could say, all right, print players, and then item 0 in the array, and it should do the first item in the list. And it did Bob. And if I say 1, it will be Lisa. And we've already covered that. But another thing that's covered in the book is you could say colon up to item 3. And this is 0, 1, 2, 3. So let's see what happens. Bob, Lisa, Greg. So we said ending at item 3, which is this item. So yeah, so that printed Bob, Lisa, and Greg. And we could say ending at item 2, and that's just Bob and Lisa, and so on and so forth. So the other thing that you could do is say, well, what if we wanted to print item 1 to 3? Starting at 1 to 3, so starting at position 1, which is Lisa, because this is item position 0, position 1, position 2, position 3, starting at position 1, and then ending at 3. So it should be just Lisa and Greg, and it is. So Lisa and Greg. Position 3 is not printed. And then the other one we could do is, what if we do it the opposite way, and we say 2 colon. If we do it this way, let's see here, 2 colon, so this started, I would think this means start at position 2. So position 2 is Greg, and then go all the way to the end, which is Jan. So 2 colon. That's just kind of a different way to access the array using a colon. And it's used a couple times pretty interestingly. Now what happens if we say starting at -3? So this is -1, -2, -3. I believe this is -1, -2, and -3. So if we say print starting at -3 and then going to the end. All right, here's another example. So we're going to set up players again. Let's just players. So there's our players in our list, and we're going to loop through the players. So we'll say for players, no, for player in players, and then we'll put in, and we'll say colon 3 in between brackets. Then we put in our colon here right into the interpreter, and then we'll say 1, 2, 3, 4 print player dot title. We'll put the title method on there, and that should start from the beginning and go Bob, Lisa, Greg, and not Jan, because that's third. Position 0, 1, 2, 3. So ending at Jan. So it would print Bob, Lisa, and Greg. It should print those players, and it should be capitalized. Let's see if it is. All right, and then enter. So I hit enter once to end the loop so that we no longer have a line that has indentation, and then I hit enter again, and then it ran the loop for me. So Bob, Lisa, and Greg. So that's pretty good. Okay, another thing that's covered in chapter 4 is I've made a new list here called My Foods, and I've got in here the string pizza, the string chicken, and the string fish. So I've got a list of the strings here of items, and this is pretty interesting. If I say your foods equals my foods, it looks like I'm saying a new variable equals my array, so maybe I should have two arrays. But the problem with that is that it's actually not doing that. So what happens is you're not copying the array my foods to a new array your foods. You're basically creating another variable that points to this very same array. So in other words, if I now say my underscore foods dot append, and we'll add an item to it. We'll add pasta. So we add an item to the list, to my foods. And then I say, okay, what's in your foods? By just, in the interpreter, we can just type the name of the list, and you can see pizza, chicken, fish, and pasta. So I added pasta to the my foods array, but when I output your foods, you can see that pasta is there too. That's because when we said your foods equals my foods, you're basically creating another variable that points to the same array that my foods points to. So you haven't really copied the array into a new array. You've just created two pointers to the same array. So if you wanted to do that, you would say something like this. Your foods equals my underscore foods, and then you would put in the brackets, the colon, and then it would basically go through each item in the array and add it to your array. So let's see here. So now I say your foods equals my foods, like that, and then I'll say your underscore foods dot append. We'll say something like ice cream, like that. So we've added ice cream to the your foods array. We made your foods. This is the way we copy it basically. So if I say your foods, we should see the ice cream. And if I run my foods, you can see there's no ice cream. So that's the way we do it if we want to copy one array to another array, call the array here and put the colon in here. So that was pretty interesting. And then the last item that's covered in the chapter, and it's just barely introduced, just a little bit, are tuples. And tuples are like a list. It's like a list, except you can't change the order of the items. You can't change the order of the items. So in other words, and the example they give in the book is something like this. So to create the tuple, which is kind of like a list, but it's different. So we'll say here, dimensions. This is the example he gives in the book. Dimensions equals, and then to make a tuple, you use parentheses, not brackets. And in this tuple, he puts in two numbers, 200 and 50. So there you go. Now you have a tuple named dimensions. It's not done with brackets, it's done with parentheses, but you can call it like a list. So you could say print, and then inside the print statement we'll say dimensions, and then we use brackets to call an item in it. So in the brackets I could say item 0. And if I do that, I get 200. And if I want to see item 1, the second item in the tuple, I can see that. And that's great. So there's 200, there's 50, and so or I could just say print dimensions, and I see both items in the tuple. But if I try to change the items, so in an array or a list, I can say dimensions, and then item 0 in dimensions, item 0 in dimensions equals 250 or 330, right? And I think what I'm doing is changing this 200 to 330, but you can see there's an error, and it says the tuple object does not support item assignment. So you can't do that. So if I want to change the tuple, I need to literally go back to the whole thing. So dimensions equals, and then I just basically redo the tuple. I can do that, and then I can call dimensions, print dimensions, and I've changed it, but I changed the whole thing. I didn't change the individual items in it. I basically recreated it. And so that's how you would, to modify a tuple, you basically have to recreate it or reassign all of the items in it. So, and then to create the tuple, once again, we use parentheses, not brackets. And that's all that's covered in the chapter. And that's it for this video.